It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much. I'm excited to launch this series. We're going to have opportunities to interview people of different Jewish professions coming up. By the way, as a sneak peek, those of you, Emily Blake, wave your hand. She's going to be our moil coming up in a week, next week. So if you want to know about the history of circumcision and how you become a moil, Emily, along with another colleague of mine, are going to be on next week. So that's a sneak peek for future events. We will have different, we're having a shochet, a slaughterer. We will have a book publisher about the history and how we publish books in the Jewish world. Today, I really wanted to kick it off with one of my favorite pieces. It's I've always felt that my shadow career is in architecture. And the biggest piece of urban architecture that one can think of is an Eruv, because it really does work to build a community. And I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about that. And so I'd like to introduce my colleague, a friend of mine, Michael Whitman, who is the rabbi of the That Israel congregation here, who has built Eruvs, who administers multiple Eruvs in Montreal, and has administered, I believe so. Is that correct, Michael?
Yes.
Yes, there we go. And why don't you start, if anybody has questions at any point in time, feel free to chat them to me, to Avi Finegold or to Julie, and we'll have a chance hopefully to get to them by the end of the session. So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your personal history with Eruvs, meaning how did you get interested in them? What made you gravitate towards building neighborhoods with Eruvs?
Thank you very much, Avi. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you, and it's a pleasure to virtually meet all of you. When I was still studying in yeshiva in Baltimore, the final year of my studies before I started my career, we studied the subject of Eruv, which is a very complicated, abstract, difficult subject. And as the, so to speak, final test, my friend and I were given the task by our teacher to build an Eruv around a college campus for a Shabbaton that was about to take place. So we were able to take everything that we learned and put it into practice. And it was a pretty amazing experience. So far in the 3 communities that I've served, there has been a need for an Eruv. We first served in New Orleans, Louisiana. There was no Eruv there. I tried to build an Eruv, but it was logistically not possible. Then in New Haven, Connecticut, I was successful after a number of years in building an Eruv and maintaining an Eruv. And then when I came to Montreal, I had the opportunity first to work with Rabbi Schmidman of blessed memory in assisting with the Eruv that already existed here. And I've also been involved with several other Eruvs around that time. So for various reasons, it's just been part of my entire professional career. It's something that is challenging, something that I enjoy. It takes creativity. It takes effort. But I enjoy it. I enjoy it.
So in a nutshell, I'm sure people ask you all the time, what is an Eruv? My favorite line about an Eruv, which is completely, of course, untrue. I don't know if I ever told you this, but Calvin Trillin once referred to an Eruv in the New Yorker as the magic schlepping circle, right? Clearly, Eruvs are a little more complicated than that, a little more involved than that. Tell us what an Eruv is, and how is it much more than just a wire?
Okay. Great. It's a great question. I do like Calvin's answer, but an Eruv is a virtual boundary around a given geographical area that removes the rabbinic restriction around carrying in public and thus makes it permissible to carry permitted objects outside on Shabbos.
So that's at a very technical level. Now, at a practical level, what does that mean, and how does that make life different? Meaning, if I didn't have an Eruv, how is my life different than if I do have an Eruv? Some people think that it means you can carry your keys to shul, right? Well, and I think it's a lot more than that.
Yeah, it is. It is. So from the point of view of a person who is observing Shabbat in a traditional manner, when there is no Eruv, a person has to worry about keys, cannot carry keys outside on Shabbat, but much more importantly, is carrying babies and pushing strollers, carrying, pushing, kicking, letting children bringing toys to a park. So those are restrictions that severely inhibit a family's opportunity to be to enjoy Shabbos. In certain communities, that burden falls disproportionately on women mothers. So this is something that frees the entire family to be able to get out, to be able to carry, to go to people's houses, have company over. So it really makes a tremendous difference in the enjoyment of Shabbos. And our rabbis have said, going back centuries, that rabbis should try to erect Eruvs in order to make Shabbos more enjoyable.
So it's interesting. Blue Greenberg, when there was an exhibit at the Yeshiva University Museum around Eruvs, was one of the speakers at one of the evening events, and she wrote this. She said this, and I've seen it written out elsewhere by her, that Eruvs have directly led to the rise of Orthodox feminism in America. That once you have the rise of Eruvs in North American cities, that's when women start populating shuls en masse, and then deciding that they want a greater involvement in their own religious life of their communities. And if you look, that there is some truth to that, in that up until the 70s, there's only 4 Eruvs in North America, right? There's St. Louis, there's Manhattan, there's Toronto, and I cannot remember for the life of me the 4th one right now. Luckily, I'm not being grilled on a presidential debate stage, but there are 4. But once you have this plethora of Eruvs that arise in the 80s, that's when people start being able to really develop their communities in this way. So that's fascinating. And as you pointed out at the end, it's not a new thing. It's not like Eruvs only start arising when large cities start arising. Eruvs have a long history in Europe, in the Middle East, in North Africa, within communities over the past 1,000 years. Do you know? Can you tell
Eruvs go back to the first temple and Jerusalem.
Oh, for sure.
It's important to keep this in mind. In Jewish law, there are two paths of laws, of mitzvos. They're biblical commandments and they're rabbinical commandments. Now, a traditional Jew will feel obligated to observe both biblical and rabbinic commandments. However, they're legislated differently. There is a biblical prohibition against carrying in a certain public domain on Shabbat. There's discussion about what the definition of that is, but let's just say, for simplicity, to carry highway, not the service road, but the highway itself.
So for those of us who don't know, who are around North America, DeCarry is the main artery cutting through Montreal, right?
So
it has a carved-in highway that's below ground, and then there's a service road on the side.
So it's a main highway that is very busy and goes completely from one side of the city to the other. So let's call that a Rosh Hashanah D'Oraisa, biblical place where carrying is not allowed. And therefore, there is no Eruv possible. There is no loophole. There is no way around that. In general, for biblical commandments, there are no exceptions. There are no exceptions except for threat to life. Obviously, God forbid there's a threat to life. All the laws of Shabbos are set aside. And the other exception would be if some other mitzvah is in opposition to it. But absent that, there are basically no exceptions. Then the rabbis came along and they had the following fear. They worried that since most of the streets where we live, Van Horn, Fleet, Harrow, Netherwood, most of the streets where we live are completely permitted on a biblical level to carry. They were worried that a person might make a mistake, and they might think that if it's possible to carry on a street like Van Horn, which is close to my house, then maybe they wouldn't recognize the difference between that and the highway. And therefore they said that these smaller streets should also have a rabbinic prohibition of carrying. However, at the same time, the rabbis generally legislated with exclusions and exceptions. Rabbis legislated exceptions for when a person's not feeling well. Rabbis legislated exceptions when the cost was too great. Here, rabbis legislated an exception when there is a visible reminder of where the boundary is. Since the reason for the prohibition is I might make a mistake of where the actual biblical prohibition starts, the rabbi said if you erect a visible visual reminder that reminds you of how far you can go and the difference between the two areas. And therefore, in the side areas, the rabbinic prohibition need not apply. So that is applied since the beginning of the legislation in the First Temple period. It has been, as you say, there was an Eruv in the Old City of Jerusalem in the First Temple period, and throughout European history and Sephardic history, most cities did have an Eruv.
So, and this goes back, I mean, there's actually a tractate of Mishnah devoted to the laws of Eruv. So anybody who goes and says that's just an exception, clearly, right, you wouldn't have an entire tractate of Mishnah specifically devoted to dealing with something which the rabbis didn't place a lot of emphasis and importance on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, there's an interesting question. The Talmudic sources mention that it is a mitzvah for rabbis to build Eruvs. And the question comes up, well, if it's a mitzvah, maybe there should be a bracha. When you make an Eruv, maybe there should be a bracha. Okay, there's some technical reasons why a bracha is not recited when putting an Eruv into place. However, it is considered to be a mitzvah, and it is something that rabbis should take care of. There are some, I would say, non-normative Jewish communities that did not have the custom of building Eruvs in their communities, but those are very much not mainstream and non-normative.
So, yeah, so Eruvs are a good thing. They allow us to carry, they allow us to be part of the communities. Anybody who learns the laws properly, in theory, can build an Eruv. Although it's a very involved process. I mean, it's not, I'm saying it's not just anybody who learns the laws. Clearly, you have to have taken this, enough steps to learn. You start by building Eruvs for Shabbatons, which are clearly more simple. I wonder if you can take us through at this point, and I mean this pun very much intended, through the nuts and bolts of building an Eruv, because it is very much involves construction, cherry pickers, regardless, putting aside the maintenance for now, but what can you tell us about the difference between building an Eruv for a camp, for a Shabbaton, for one weekend, and then start moving into thinking about what does it take to build an Eruv around a neighborhood and within an urban environment?
Well, it's a very good question. The process is basically the same, and that is the first step is to ascertain if an Eruv is possible. There are certain areas that cannot have an Eruv. So if it does include one of these areas that is Rishus Harabim D'Oraisa, biblically defined public domain, no Eruv is possible. If there is a certain kind of body of water, no Eruv is possible. If there is forest land or unused land with certain definitions to it, no Eruv is possible. A cemetery is a problem. So the first question is, given this area, is it possible to build an Eruv? That's question number one. The next question is, what do you have to do to construct this perimeter? Now, the perimeter can be made of all kinds of different things. There can be natural boundaries like walls or fences. There can be steep slopes can serve as an Eruv. Sometimes existing utility wires can either be used as part of the perimeter or they can be easily manipulated to be used. Of course, it's always important to make sure you have complete permission from every relevant organization and company before doing anything to poles or wires. Sometimes that can be used. And then sometimes it's possible to erect a pole, to put up wires, again, with all the correct permissions involved. So the second part is the planning of how to be able to configure what do you have already there? What would you have to build? Is it feasible? Do you have permissions to do what you want to do? If you're going onto anyone's land, do you have their written permission to do so? And then you would be able to determine what the cost is. Of course, there's usually more than one way to do it. So as we're designing an Eruv, we're trying to design it with two goals in mind. Number one, keep the cost down. Usually that's an issue. Number two, durability. To rely on something that is likely to fall is not ideal. You want to try to come up with a design that is as durable as possible. Number three, you want a design that is unobtrusive, that does not attract attention. We're not looking for attention. We don't want vandalism. We don't want other people looking at it. We want the people that need it to be able to see it, but we would rather keep it out of sight from everybody else. So once that's been done, then there's an idea of how much time it would take and how much money it would cost. Then comes engaging a construction company to help with the work. That will depend on how large it is. Of course, it's important to have a company, if they're professionals, that have all the tools they need, a cherry picker, other kinds of tools, and also a company that is willing to accommodate the requirements. They have to be flexible, and they have to be willing to take the directions that we give. So once we have that company, then we start the work. The work has to be supervised to make sure that every step of it is done correctly. Sometimes when I was building an Eruv, if I would take a break for just a few minutes while the crew was working to grab a bite of lunch, I would come back and see that they had to go back over and redo the last 3 poles because they had been done incorrectly. So you have to keep a very close eye on it. So those are the steps. Then comes the community education. It's very important on an ongoing basis to educate the community about where the Eruv is, how to use it, what is permitted by the Eruv, what is not permitted by the Eruv. So that community education part is also key.
Okay, so if I can just go through some of these steps. Let's say we're looking at, you come into a city and you decide you're asked to build the Eruv, you're the new rabbi in town, you do your survey, right, of what is in theory the biggest possible Eruv, given the cost-benefit analysis of that, because you can build a very large Eruv, but it takes a lot of energy to maintain such a large Eruv. We're always looking at the most durable. So wire, which is the classic understanding, people don't always think about the fact that wire is one of the last tools that you want to use to build an Eruv. You're always looking at building walls or railroad sidings and natural barriers like rivers that have steep slopes going into the water. So in Chicago, for example, Lake Michigan forms part of the Eruv wall because it's always there and it's always natural. And yet when there's some neighborhoods that have beaches, the slope of the beach is too shallow to allow that to be part of the Eruv. And so these are the factors that you're looking into. And then you're going to start looking at figuring out the minimum number of places where you're going to be building the wire itself, that you cannot use buildings or other natural, artificial or natural existing buildings. And then you've built your perimeter. You've established it, it works, it's in place. Now you've told everybody what the parameters are. You've set up a Google map with all of the exact intersections. You've set up the visible markers that are open to people. I remember, right, and we can talk about that for a second. There's a term that everybody that you learn in Hebrew called a lechi, right, which forms one of the visible markers for where the Eruv works in terms of the wire. I remember this because growing up, the original iteration of the Montreal Era ended on my on my street. And it meant that our house was in the Eruv, but we couldn't go out to the front steps because it was the hydro poles, it was the electrical poles in front. And my dad would always point out to me the lechis, and he says, you can carry, but you have to go out the back door. Right, and these are all visible. Now everybody knows about the Eruv. People can carry in certain ways. They can bring their children to shul. But the Eruv, I think, only comes alive with the next step, which is checking.
Right, you're correct. Well, there are 2 more steps before that.
Okay.
So there are 2 more steps. One is there is a requirement that we rent from the municipal authorities the right to be able to carry in this area. So that requires a ceremony.
I have gone personally to the
where
borough
we go personally to the mayor, the police chief, those officials, and we rent the right to use it. This is a requirement. I remember a story that my teacher told me in Baltimore that when he built the Eruv in Baltimore, Rabbi Heinemann, he said that he told the mayor of Baltimore that he needed to come to do the ceremony to give him some money. And the mayor said, well, I'm sorry, I can't do that because the ethics laws prevent me from accepting any amount of money from private individuals. So my Rebbe, Rav Heinemann, is a very smart guy. So what he did is he made a plaque, and he presented it with a plaque in honor of Mayor so-and-so for his assistance to the Jewish community, and included in the plaque were two silver dollars that were part of the plaque. So he didn't hand them coins, but he handed them the plaque, and the mayor received the plaque. So that needs to be done. And then the last step, which is actually the part that is the Eruv, everything that we've been talking about up until now has really been just the wires. The Eruv refers to something different. The word Eruv means joined together. And it refers to how do Jews join together? We join together by sharing a meal. And therefore, we create a situation where there is the opportunity to join together in a meal. The way that we do that is that we take a food that is not perishable. Matzah works very well. We take that box of matzah, we place it in a location that anyone within the Eruv could get to. For example, my office. Anybody who wants to come can come. And that matzah belongs in partnership to every single Jewish person who is here, whether they know about it or not. And so everyone is actually ma'urav, joined together by equal ownership in this box of matzah. So what allows us to carry is the fact that we are enclosed by the boundaries, and we are joined together in this box of matzah. That's what allows us to carry. Once that is in place, of course, it is necessary to maintain it, especially with an Eruv in a city. It is easily broken and must be checked carefully every Friday to make sure that it is up.
So I think I told you this when I assumed the pulpit for an interim position in Montreal at the Spanish and Portuguese congregation. The first day that I walked into my office, it was one of the greatest honors as a lover of Eruvs to look up, and on the top shelf was a box of matzah with a big Post-it note on it, and one of the oversized Post-it notes that said, "This is the Montreal Eruv. Do not touch this," right? In the sense that the cleaning crew should not ever throw this out. But in theory, anybody who wanted to come and eat from this matzah, this was part of the community. And I was the holder of the Eruv for the year that I was there. And it was a wonderful feeling to know that that was my office and I could look at it constantly.
And you did a great job of it.
Oh, I didn't touch it. That last piece is where I really...
Just so everyone knows, I don't want anyone to get nervous. We get a new box of matzah, fresh box of matzah every year.
That was the other thing I remember, that Erev Pesach, and I put this out, I did a Facebook Live event before they were like de rigueur, where I transferred the matzah Post-it to the new box of matzah, and I said, "This is the Montreal Eruv," and everybody in the staff got to take part in it, and I put it up there in the same place, in the same shelf, and that was that. All of this is the making of, the maintenance of the Eruv is, like I said, where I think the coming alive, the real nature of it, where it becomes more than just this virtual wall. It's a real, barrier. It's a real boundary, I should say, not a barrier. It's a genuine boundary that is checked on a regular basis, more than we check so many other fences and gates and walls, because fences, gates, and walls are, they're just walls. If our Eruv was a brick wall, we wouldn't have to check it every week. Right? And yet, because in an urban Eruv, there are so many little pieces that are, a wire attaching to a building, checking the railroad, that they didn't change their fence for any reason, a wire didn't blow down. The checking of the Eruv actually makes it very alive. It means that this is the boundary that we live in. This is the space that we live in. And we often build communities around Eruvs. Right? We can talk about that in a second, but that checking is an essential feature that says that this is not just a wire that we put up and we leave there. It means on a regular basis, we're making sure that this is still there.
Yeah, checking the Eruv is very hard, and it requires a person that has a special aptitude for detail, for noticing detail. It's very hard driving the same stretch of road, looking at the same thing every week, to notice the slightest change. And in my experience, some people get it and some people just don't get it. And so the first thing is, whoever checks the Eruv, we have to check the checkers. And I will often go along either before or after them just to make sure that they did not miss anything. Of course, I could miss something also. I'm also not perfect. But it requires a high degree of attention. If you're just driving along and you just are looking at where you're going, which you need to do, driving safely, you could very well miss the one spot where there's a problem. So it requires great diligence and great effort to make sure that it is checked properly to ensure that it's kosher every week.
So I have checked Eruvs. I've checked Eruvs in Chicago. I've checked Eruvs here in Westmount, and I've seen the Eruv with you in the Greater Montreal Era, and I'm noticing things. As an Eruv checker, you always tend to notice things that many people tend to go for granted. But the Eruv is checked every Thursday or Friday, correct?
We check ours every Friday morning.
So there is permission to check at earlier in theory, right? One can check as early as Wednesday or Thursday, according to some people.
Well, there may be different opinions.
The opinion that we
follow,
is to check it Friday morning.
The opinion that we follow is to check it Friday morning, unless, for example, in the case of Yom Tov, so next week Shavuos is Friday and Shabbos, so we will check it on Thursday morning. There might be some other extraordinary circumstance where we would do it earlier, but in general, we do it on Friday morning.
So this is the part that I think people don't realize, is how often it gets checked, which is literally every week, which takes a few hours, how often, and maybe you can give me a number roughly, 10% or 40% or 20, how often there's actually a problem in that checking. It's not just a literal checking every week, and every week you say, yes, it's wonderful, it's fine, but there often needs a repair to the Eruv. And people aren't aware of this. So maybe you can just tell us a bit about the number about that and what are the types of repairs that happen at a small level on a Friday afternoon in order to get the Eruv ready for Shabbos.
That's a good question. So we keep a log every week of what happens, where it happened, to try to look for patterns. If we see something problematic in one place repeatedly, we'll try to redo that or reroute it. The incidence of problems varies greatly. So, for example, the last couple of months, thank God, there have been very few problems because there's been very little traffic, very little construction, very little snow, a little bit of snow, but very little problems. Overall, I would say maybe 20 to 30% of the time, there is something that has to be fixed on the Eruv, and I would say maybe on a Friday, which we then do, and I would say maybe 10% of the time it's something that if we did not fix that, the entire Eruv would actually be down. So please don't take it for granted, and a person should check. We have, for our Eruv, Snowden, Hampstead, Côte St. Luc, we have a website. We have a phone line, we have an email system, and we give out that information. And a person should call in, should check to make sure that it is up. But I would say those are our numbers. In general, our Eruv is very stable. Harsh weather is really not a problem for our Eruv. Snow is really not a problem for our Eruv. The two things that are problems for our Eruv is when there is wind that is so strong that it brings down electrical poles. So that's something that we have to look at very carefully. Construction can interfere with the Eruv, and not snow, but the aftermath of snow. So snow clearing can disrupt something on a pole that we have to look at carefully. So those are kind of the three areas that we worry about the most. But the one thing that we keep in mind about an Eruv is we make no assumptions. Anything can happen anytime. We never take it for granted, and we check everything, and very often we're surprised. But I'd say overall, about 30% of the time there's something wrong that needs to be fixed that Friday.
How often is the Eruv down for Shabbos? How many times has that happened since you've been in Montreal, for example?
So far, the number is 0.
Wow. So that's amazing, because I have remembered that, for example, in Chicago, our Eruv went down a couple of times and it was unable to be fixed. And what that does actually, I found in my experience, that actually highlights the fact that the Eruv is so necessary for people. I remember once when I was living in Boston, that the Boston community, because the Eruv does cost money to maintain, and the Eruv committee wasn't getting enough donations, and they deliberately, I don't know, I'm not advocating for this, I'm just reporting it, that they deliberately didn't check the Eruv one Shabbos, and they announced that the Eruv was down this Shabbos because it wasn't checked and it didn't have a chazakah of being up, and people were incensed that the Eruv was down, and I can assure you that within a week they got the requisite donations for the rest of the year. But this was their method of reminding people that they don't take the Eruv for granted.
Yeah, people have made that suggestion to me, and that we should announce in advance a certain Shabbos the Eruv will be down. I'm not willing to agree to that. First of all, somebody could have something planned, a simcha, for example, for that Shabbos, and there's no way to know about it. And I don't think that's a good idea. And so we try. But it is inevitable that it will be down. There are certain things that if they happen close to Shabbos, it is just simply not possible. We put in our best effort. So far, our best effort has been enough, but it could very well happen that it would be something that we're not able to fix, and we would have to announce that. It would not be the end of the world. One thing to keep in mind, this is something that I always think about. A few people said to me over the last couple of months, they said, well, listen, people are not supposed to be going out of their houses. You should keep the Eruv down in order to promote
Yes, I remember saying this to a colleague.
quarantine. So I disagree with that. First of all, because even under quarantines, there are permissible ways and safe ways to go outside by yourself for a walk, and I did not want to prohibit that. But there's something that I always keep in mind, and that's the question, for whom are we building an Eruv? Well, the obvious answer is those people who, without an Eruv, would have to stay inside, would not be able to carry outside. That's one part. But the other answer is every single Jewish person. Every single Jewish person, whether they observe Shabbat or not, they are, from a traditional point of view, bound by the laws of Judaism. They may agree or not agree. They have the right to practice or not to practice. I respect everyone's decision. But the truth is, from the point of view of the commandments, they're not observing. When there is an Eruv, that means, even though they had no intention whatsoever, all of those people who are not keeping Shabbos, at least they're not carrying inside the Eruv. We have reduced the layer and level of infractions to that extent. I realize that that's not something that they will appreciate, but from a spiritual point of view, it's something that's very important. And so the need to have an Eruv is not only for those people who are observing Shabbat. If anything, it's more important for those people who are not observing Shabbat.
So I have a couple of questions here from the chat. First of all, is there a size limit on Eruv? Right, and I heard this in the reverse once. Somebody asked me, why can't we build a small, very well-protected Eruv in a very known circle and assume that that's not the interior of the Eruv, that's the exterior of the Eruv, and the rest of the world is inside the Eruv?
So the answer is yes, there is a maximum size. So a continent cannot be an Eruv. So Australia is not an Eruv. It has to be some size that is a metropolitan area. It cannot be something that goes beyond the bounds of a single metropolitan area. Now, obviously, a metropolitan area can be gigantic, but even in New York, there are many places where the Eruv is not possible, and that's why there are separate Eruvim in New York. Here in Montreal, at one time there was a plan to have one Eruv that encompassed all of Montreal. Now, that was long before I came here. And what I'm going to tell you now, I only know secondhand. I don't know it firsthand. But there was apparently a rabbi who came from somewhere else, and he proclaimed that by definition, the entire island of Montreal was an Eruv, and no Eruv was necessary. And it was a very short time after that that rabbis of greater authority weighed in and said that in respectful terms, that's just baloney.
So
It's
this,
not true, doesn't work, it's not correct. So here in Montreal, there are several different Eruvs, and there need to be several Eruvs because there are areas between us where it is not possible to cross or to include. So there is a maximum size, not an actual number limit or size limit, but some kind of metropolitan area would be the maximum.
okay, so yeah, I don't know if you know this, but Montreal has a very famous piece of trivia around the Eruv in that one of the most famous rabbis of Montreal, Rabbi Yodel Rosenberg, once wrote a tshuva, a halachic discourse specifically dealing with the prams and pushing prams on Shabbos. Nobody accepts this, but it's a very well known, and it was published, that he said that in order to push a pram on Shabbos, all you have to do is put 4 poles around the pram and put an Eruv around the stroller itself, and that's considered an Eruv, and you can push that. So there's an essay, our colleague Ira Robinson has published about this piece, and it's a famous piece, but like I said, nobody really holds by this, but this is part of the Montreal lore of Eruvs as well. Anyways. What about political backlash? You brought this up in terms of communities and communities, people automatically keeping Shabbat. And this is one of the discussions that I've heard in the past, specifically relating to people saying, I don't want to be part of your religious neighborhood, right? In a specific way, when you say, well, I don't want you to make me religious by saying that I don't carry on Shabbos. And that's one of the discussions I've heard. What about in general, the political backlash that you've had? I know that Arabs are generally very, very cautious and very sensitive to political involvement and making sure that A, something flies under the radar, and B, and doesn't involve as many people in large public consultations. And part of it also is educating the community. Can you tell us a little bit about any political backlash you've heard of, or you know about, or you've been involved with regarding Eruvs?
Sure. Fortunately, here in Montreal, we have had very good experiences. Across North America, there have been a number of cases where it's been extremely ugly. There have been court cases, a lot of animosity, accusations of anti-Semitism, really terrible things. And often those cases started where the work was done without the correct permissions in place first. And that is really a key. Never, ever put something up without permission of the local authorities, of the owner.
In addition, it halachically invalidates it based on what you said originally.
Right. Not only halachically invalidates it, but sours the atmosphere to the extent that it may not be fixable, even if it is deemed legal, but it may not be salvageable. So I've always insisted on being very, very upfront, getting all the permissions, written authorizations, etc. And that has reduced the problems immensely. So we have not had any such problem here in Montreal. All the political figures that we have approached have been happy to work with us. And we have not suffered any kind of anti-Semitic vandalism or anything like that, which does occur in other places. So we are very fortunate in that regard. And I think the key is to go about it the right way, making sure to do it properly, get the right permissions in advance, get the authorization in advance. That's the key.
Excellent. So just as a way to wrap up, to start thinking things, closing, are there any from the annals of, I can't believe this ever happened to you when in your history of administering and building Eruvs?
How much time do I have?
Pick your top 2.
My top 2. I once got a call from a woman in my shul, and she said to me, Rabbi, I didn't know that you had taken a job working at the Jewish General Hospital. So I said, well, I'm not working at the Jewish General Hospital. Why do you say that? She said, well, I saw you on a ladder outside the building of the Jewish General Hospital. So I said, no, I was part of the work for the Eruv. At that time, currently the Jewish general is not included in the Eruv, but at that time it was. And there was a problem, and I had to fix it, and it required climbing a ladder and reattaching a wire. So she saw me. I remember one time I had a problem on the corner of Cavendish and Coatsing Road. There's a gas station
large
there.
intersection with the gas station, yes.
Yeah. And what's amazing about the Eruv is it requires creative thought. It requires looking at something and you don't see the solution, and somehow you got to figure out a solution. And I remember it was cold, it was raining, the wire was down, or they had taken down a pole or something, and I was walking around and I just couldn't figure it out. I just couldn't figure it out. And I was walking and I was standing in the medium in between the road in the rain with a raincoat, and someone passed by and they called me on my phone. They said, Rabbi, is something wrong? First of all, why are you standing in the rain? And second of all, you look very sad. What's wrong? So I said, well, you know, thank God everything's okay. I'm just having a problem with the Eruv. And fortunately, after a while, I was able to figure it out. One last story I'll tell you. This also happened near the Jewish General. When they started construction, before it was detached from the Eruv, we had to do a lot of work moving things around, reattaching things. And there came time when they took down a wire, and we had to redo the setup. And again, I was walking around, I was thinking it through, I was looking at every option, and I couldn't figure it out. And I was depressed, and I was frustrated, and I was just walking around. And so I was walking on Legary, and just completely concentrating on this problem and not coming up with an answer. And it was a Friday, I needed an answer. And a man approached me. I don't know this man. Was he Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet? Could be. But he approached me and he said, what's wrong? And I said, well, I'm in charge of the Eruv, and there's a problem, and I can't figure out a solution. So he said, would you like me to give you a bracha, a blessing? So I said, sure. I would, please give me a bracha that I should be able to figure out how to fix this Eruv. And he gave me a bracha. And about 30 minutes later, I figured it out. And I have never seen that man again.
It's a beautiful
thing. But it happened. That's how it happened.
So, so we've seen that an Eruv is something really real. It's not just a wire that's strung up once and left there, and that gives us a loophole, so to speak. It's a very real thing that we do. And to me, the best example of that is that it really builds communities. I did the research of a colleague of mine actually did his master's thesis in Montreal in urban planning that touched on this in some way and showed that your property taxes, your values go up when you are inside an Eruv. And he did this actually by looking at border cases. When, you know, some streets, one side of the street is inside the Eruv and the other side is outside the Eruv, people want to live inside the Eruv as much as they can. And it's more than just, you know, being close to the shul. It's being close to other people, and you can walk not just to shul on Shabbos, but you can walk to other people, right? The ability to bring something to a friend, the ability to go to somebody for a meal and bring them a bottle of wine that you can share together. This is the essence of what an Eruv is. It builds communities together, and Eruvs follow communities as they move along. You know, I did a presentation once on the history of the Eruvs in Chicago, and I showed how the Eruvs move with the communities. And as soon as a community develops with enough people, there's a need to build an Eruv, and there's a recognition. And as soon as the Eruv happens, there's a tipping point in that community where a lot more people are willing to move into that community. I wonder if you have any final thoughts to say, in that vein, or anything else about Eruv as we come to a close about our really interesting discussion about
Well,
Eruv and communities.
an Eruv symbolically joins together the Jewish people, and it creates unity, and it has the potential, exactly as you say, to bring Jews together. And that's the goal of the Eruv. And hopefully with the Eruvs that we are building here and in other places, they're doing exactly that. They're allowing Jews to have more of a connection to each other, allowing Jews to be able to enjoy Shabbos, allowing Jews to be able to enjoy the benefits that this area of Jewish law allows.